My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this Thursday Thoughts video, I wanted to talk about something that I just read recently, which is the Statute of Finwe and Miriel in the volume Morgoth's Ring, which is number 10 in the history of Middle-earth. This is the part of the volume where he goes into, it's part of a broader section of the laws and customs of the Eldar, and it deals with Elven divorce, because in Elven culture, you don't get divorced, really, but there is an exception for when one spouse dies, because Tolkien says it's not really a true death, because they're still within Arda and they can be reborn, but for one reason or another, they're never going to leave Mondos, and therefore the other spouse is stuck being unmarried. In that case, Finwe, as the first person to have this, he gets the option to marry again, because Miriel has said, I'm not ever coming out, I don't want to live anymore. And there's details that I'm not going to get into, but I found this interesting rereading it again, because as I was reading it, it occurred to me that it seems almost like a gloss on what Jesus says about marriage in the Gospels. And of course, Tolkien being a Catholic, and Catholics having a very, very strong view on divorce and all that stuff, I can't help but think that he was doing that kind of intentionally, because what Jesus says in the Gospels is basically, you're supposed to get married and stay together for life. And the Pharisees are like, well, why did Moses allow for divorce? And Jesus says, because of your hardness of heart. And you're really only supposed to get divorced if there's some kind of, I don't remember exactly the term used, but the implication is it's like, if the other party is basically cheating on you, then, that would be the instance where you could divorce. And the hardness of heart comment is where I really hook into this, because in the Statute of Finwe and Miriel, it describes the conversation that is had with Finwe after the statute is kind of announced. And I don't remember if it's Manwe or Mondos now, but one or the two of them basically tells Finwe, look, you have permission to do this. That doesn't mean it's a good idea. Because in the debate that the Valar have on this issue, they talk about the fact that choosing to go that route of taking another spouse is kind of an abandonment of hope, or Estel hope, not Umdir hope, but Estel hope. And therefore it's suboptimal. It's kind of derived from Arda Mard and not really from Arda as it should have been had Melkor not interfered and created discord. So this idea that Finway's choice is free, but nevertheless one choice is kind of a reflection of something that's gone wrong, is kind of like Jesus' comment to the Pharisees that you're allowed to get divorced because of the hardness of your heart. In other words, the better, thing to do, the higher road to take, is to try to fix things, not merely to just say, well, you broke the rules, you're out. And so it struck me that this whole thing is kind of like an extension of, or a gloss on, that passage in the Gospels. And the reason I take this a little further is because if you think about it, Jesus' whole comment is basically to the effect that once you're married, the point of that is that it's for life. And there are exceptions, but they're very, very rare, and they even then shouldn't necessarily be taken. The Elven thing with the Statute of Finwe and Miriel is kind of the same, but the difference here is that unlike humans who really do die and never come back, and Jesus will say at one point, because the Pharisees will ask him in a separate instance, what happens when 7 guys marry the same woman because they all die and she remarries the brothers, who is her husband in the afterlife? And he's like, don't you get it? They're not actually, there is no marrying or giving in marriage in, after death. That's not a thing. But what happens when you have elves who do live forever, or even if they're killed, or for whatever reason, their spirit is separated from their body, have the option to come back? This complicates the question. If Finwe were immortal, and Miriel were immortal, and Miriel dies just for any reason, Finwe would have the option to remarry, because once you die, you're not coming back. And that person can then be married again and still be married to only one person. But the elves, that's not how they operate. They live forever. And when they go to Mondos, the theory is, at least for the vast majority, that they will eventually be reborn or incarnated in some way, such that they can then go and get back with their old spouse again, and they can take up married life again. So it's an interesting thing, because Tolkien here is basically saying, okay, well, what if we take what Jesus said, but now apply it to this different kind of being that doesn't actually die permanently? How does that work itself out? And this is a thing that is a big theme with Tolkien, not necessarily pulling Christian doctrine and seeing how it plays out, but just seeing how things that apply to mortals would play out for a race that's really not mortal. And so this is just one instance of that, but it's a really specific instance of, it looks like to me, and again, I can't read his mind, so I don't know this, but it seems like he's taking, this view of, Christian divorce and saying, okay, but what if we then take it a step further and say, what happens when you have immortal people for whom the exception doesn't even apply? And this is why he comes up with the rule in the Statute of Finwe and Miriel of, well, the person who's in Mondos has to basically say, I am not coming out. And then, even then, you get like a 10 or 12 Valian year waiting period of, are you still sure about that? Yes. Okay, now it's permanent. Mondos makes it irrevocable, and then the person who's outside can remarry. Or if, for some reason, Mondos is like, you ain't ever getting out, I don't care what you want, then the same thing applies. And you can imagine maybe a couple of people that this might apply to. Girl Next Gondor may hate me for this, as might the Clueless Fangirl, but Feanor, he probably stuck in there forever. But, Noldorin fanboyism aside, or fangirlism aside, point being, there are cases in which an elf is never coming out of Mondos for one reason or another. And the funny thing about this, of course, is in at least certain versions of the story, after Finwe is killed by Morgoth, he ends up in Mondos and kind of reconnects with Miriel, and then he sacrifices his ability to come back out so that Miriel can come back out. So it kind of reversed the whole thing, and then it's like, well, does that technically follow the rule? And Mondos is like, well, I mean, Indus is, not married to him because he's dead. I mean, is married to him, but it's not like she's going to be married to somebody else and him at the same time if he's stuck in there. And he can't be married to two people if he's in here. So as long as he's stuck in here forever, it works. So, just the way that Tolkien is thinking about how to make this whole concept work for an immortal race is just a really fascinating example of something he does a lot, which is explore what it means to be immortal and the implications that has for human nature, we might say. So it just struck me as a really good example to talk about, because it's more than just taking, what would it mean to be immortal and how would that affect your outlook on life or whatever. It takes a very specific example and really, really dives into it. So I just thought it was really cool to talk about. So that's my Thursday thought for this week. I will see you on the next one. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially Elf Friends P.A. Brew News, Nathan Dufour, and Paul Leone.